I'm going to do a pretty wide-ranging talk today. So I'm going to actually cover elements of sort of the broader project, and that's going to be the first half of the talk, is really just talking about the broader project. And then I'm going to talk about two specific papers that are underway. And I want to acknowledge at the beginning that this project has been colossal, has been by far the most intensive data collection activity I've ever done. And it would not have been possible without the 7 PhD students and 10 master's and undergraduate students who have been participating in the work. So, and you'll see as we go along just how colossal this work has been. So this is an overview of where we're going to go. I'm going to start with just a brief overview of why I think it's important to study textbooks and curriculum materials. I'm going to give you a broad project overview for the whole project. And then I'm going to focus specifically on California, because California is actually one of 5 states that I'm studying, and talk about the school accountability report cards, which are the source of the data in California. I'm going to present a lot of descriptive textbook data on, as David said, Common Core material adoption, but also what we're starting to learn about science and English language arts. I'm going to spend more time than maybe I should focusing on the problems of the SARCs and the challenges in making sense of the textbook adoption data. Then I'm going to present results from our first working paper, which actually looks at the impact of math textbook adoption choices from the 2008 adoption cycle on student achievement. Present some qualitative work that we're doing involving school district leaders, and then discuss next steps. So that's a very ambitious agenda, but I think it can happen. So why should we study textbooks? Well, there's some good recent experimental and quasi-experimental evidence that textbooks actually matter substantially for student achievement. And of course we know that textbooks influence teachers' instruction. And these studies, again, very high quality research designs that make us really confident that these are cause and effect relationships, show that just the choice of one textbook over another can have a pretty substantial impact on student learning. Now these studies have all been done in the context of elementary math, and the study that I'm going to present to you is also elementary math. But hopefully down the road we'll be expanding that work to other grades and subjects as well. And the reason why I think that textbooks are so promising, even if these impacts on student achievement are modest, say we're finding achievement impacts typically around 1/10 to 1/5 of a standard deviation, that textbooks are an extremely inexpensive intervention. Right? The typical textbook costs somewhere less than $100. And especially when you think about the marginal cost of choosing one textbook over another textbook, that marginal cost is typically going to be very close to 0, because all textbooks cost about the same. So in terms of the return on investment, I'm skeptical that you'll find something that is more cost efficient or cost effective than textbooks for improving student outcomes. Textbooks also, I think, are less politically fraught than many of the other policies that are currently being pursued to improve student outcomes, things like school choice, teacher labor policies. Certainly there are controversies about textbooks, and we're very familiar with debates over the best way to teach math, for instance. But I think that we could probably agree that they're less politically fraught than some of these other things. And the entrenched interests are a little bit less. I also want to acknowledge before I go on that this work is funded by the National Science Foundation and also funded by an anonymous foundation that has provided me with 2 years' worth of support. So hopefully I've made a case that textbooks matter. So the issue is, if you want to study the impact of textbooks on student outcomes, that states generally don't keep track of which textbooks are used where. Now there are exceptions to that. California is one of those exceptions, and I'll talk to you about the California SARC data in a moment. Some other exceptions are Texas, Louisiana, and New Mexico. But to my knowledge, those are the only 4 out of 50. And so as a result, if the state doesn't keep track of this information, then it turns out that it's very difficult to study the impact of textbooks on student learning because it's impossible to really know who is using what materials unless you go and ask the districts. And of course, there's lots of school districts in this country, and they don't necessarily want to respond unless you force them to. So this is a challenge for research because it doesn't allow you to do these kinds of quasi-experimental studies like I'm going to present in a little bit. But it's also a challenge, I think, for policy and practice because you know, when you talk to school district leaders, and I'll present some qualitative evidence on this, they feel like they don't have evidence on what's a good textbook. And they are often relying on who's around them, the districts in their immediate vicinity, and what materials they're adopting. But if we had better evidence and more public evidence, I think that you could imagine uses for policy and practice, things like joint professional development around curriculum materials and common adopting districts. So as I mentioned, what I'm going to present today is work that's funded by the National Science Foundation and an anonymous foundation. I've been fortunate to receive 2 additional grants to continue the work from the W.T. Grant Foundation and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The broader agenda is focused on 5 states. So it's focused on California, Illinois, Texas, New York, and Florida. And those were chosen strictly because they are the 5 largest U.S. states by population. And the questions that are driving the work are listed here. And the ones in bold are the ones I'm going to at least touch on today. So first, we're just interested descriptively in who's adopting what. What are the patterns of textbook adoption in the 5 largest U.S. states? And you can use this to answer interesting questions about, say, the equitable distribution of curriculum materials, right? Do schools serving more low-income kids have access to as current materials, for instance? Another question that I'll touch on today is how are adoption patterns changing as Common Core or other college and career-ready standards roll out? I'm also doing some qualitative work to investigate how school districts make adoption decisions. How do they choose from among the books that they're presented? With funding from W.T. Grant, I'm going to talk to teachers then about how they actually use the materials that the district formally adopts and how they supplement those materials, because we all know that teachers are increasingly turning to these online sources to supplement curriculum materials. And then finally, we're interested in this impact question. What's the actual impact of particular textbook choices on student outcomes? So briefly, I'm going to give you some context for the California data. And so the California data arise out of the Williams v. California case. And this was a case that was brought on behalf of student plaintiffs from the San Francisco Unified School District. And the allegation in this lawsuit is that students were being deprived of the minimum fundamentals necessary to receive a quality education. In particular, adequate curriculum materials, high-quality teachers, and adequate school facilities, right? And the state was being blamed for failing to provide oversight over those conditions. And there were a number of research briefs that were put forth by very prominent scholars, Linda Darling-Hammond, Jeannie Oakes. And in those briefs, they cited evidence that around 10% of California teachers did not have sufficient textbooks for all the students in their class. And another third of teachers didn't have enough materials to send a copy home with students. And when students did have textbooks, they were often woefully out of date. So this court case was brought in the early 2000s, and they cited evidence that some schools had textbooks that still mentioned the Soviet Union as being in existence. So, so the Williams case argued that the state was really neglecting to do its due diligence and to oversee the adequate provision of curriculum materials. The settlement or legislation that came out of the Williams case established a number of new requirements, all right? So it established, first of all, that students have a right to sufficient textbooks, and also to those other 2 conditions that I mentioned, qualified teachers and schools in good repair. It required yearly self-evaluations of these resources to be published annually in a School Accountability Report Card, or SARC. It established a new complaint procedure to report violations of these requirements. It provided additional emergency funding to address maintenance issues in the lowest 30% of schools. I believe that's as defined by average performance levels. And it required annual inspection of textbooks, teachers, and facilities in those lowest 30% of schools. So you can see there's really two different ideas here. One, in the lowest 30% of schools, there is actual monitoring of textbook adequacy, right? And where there is not sufficient textbook adequacy, that there's actually additional resources being put into the system. And this is sort of a form of reciprocal accountability. The state is going to be responsible for providing that funding to ensure that students have access to those materials. In the other 70% of schools, where there aren't the annual inspections, there is merely public accountability, right? Schools are required to put this information on the SARC to say that the curriculum materials in their school are adequate, and that's a form of public accountability. So these are the data sources for our study. So we use the SARCs, the School Accountability Report Cards, to collect data on the textbooks that are used in all schools in the state of California. And the work that we're doing right now is focused only on schools that contain a grade between K and 8. That is, we exclude schools that are only 9 to 12, so we exclude high schools. That was strictly because we just ran out of time and money. And high schools, as you know, or as you might know, adopt many more different kinds of books than elementary schools do, so it's just harder to code. So the SARCs are available on the school website, SARC Online. I think it's sarconline.org. And you can get the two most recent years on that website. You can often get older SARCs elsewhere on the web. The SARCs are available in a PDF format, and to my knowledge, that's the only format they're available in. Now, for 15%, around 15% of schools that use a uniform reporting form, you can ask the state or FOIA the state, and they'll give you a data file that contains the information. But for the other 85% of schools, as far as I know, the only way to get the data is to go to the PDF SARCs. There's a wide variety of SARC formats, and I'll show you actually some snippets of different SARCs that basically every school district can use its own format. Now, there's required elements that need to be on the SARC. I don't believe that those elements have to be in any particular order. If that's true, I can tell you that that's not what is actually happening. There's also no required naming format for textbooks, and I'll show you how this creates many problems when you're trying to understand what textbooks are actually used in schools. All right, so again, we're relying on these SARCs as the source of our textbook data. And again, I mentioned earlier, but California is one of only 4 states that even make this data available at all. Other states, I can tell you the other 3 states make it available in a much more usable format than California, but still, California is at least ahead of the other 46 that don't collect it at all. So what's the process? So the process is first we have to locate the SARCs. For most schools, this is actually very, very easy because it's on the SARC website. For some schools, it's not on the SARC website. It's on the district website, or you find it through Google. So you locate the SARCs, we download and we save the SARCs, and we do this because sometimes the SARCs vanish, and also because we want to make sure that we have these forever, and I think USC's unlimited Google Drive storage, where I think we're at over 2 terabytes of PDFs now for the 3 years that we've collected. So now you've got the SARC. Then you have to try and figure out what the textbooks are. So I have master's and undergraduate students who I've paid to copy and paste the textbook name from the SARC and also the adoption year. Then those same students do their best effort to code that book. So we created a list of possible textbooks, which in math right now is about 900 possible textbooks. So we're creating a book code so that we can, instead of having words, we can have a code that we can use to uniquely identify that book. And then we use this clean coded list for all of the analyses that I'm going to present to you. So the hard part is this part, going from what's listed on the SARC to a book code. And I'm going to show you some examples of SARC textbook reports that are at varying levels of quality, from good to bad, and that will illustrate the challenges here. So this is the best. This is the best you could possibly get. This is an actual SARC. This is from Carruthers Elementary and Carruthers Unified, which I actually don't know where in the state Carruthers is. This is perfect. The data could not be any better because we've got publishers, we've got titles which are accurate. These are accurate and there's no typos. We have adoption years, which I also believe to be accurate. And also we have grades provided for each book. So this is as good as it gets. I would say very few schools have data that's this good, because really this is quite easy. Once you know, once you have the list of possible textbooks, it's very easy to code these. California, first of all these books were on the state-approved list in math, and so it's just really, really nice. All right, so this is as good as it gets. The next best will be something like this. So this is a SARC from Lake Elementary School in Lake Elementary School District. And this is pretty good. So if I'm looking at math, 2015 McGraw-Hill Everyday Math, that's something that I know what it is. 2013 College Preparatory Mathematics. So this is something where it turns out that College Preparatory Mathematics makes a lot of different textbook series in grades 6 to 8. And so one of those textbook series was adopted by the state in its most recent adoption. And so if I assume that when they list a year that corresponds with the most recent adoption and they list a publisher that has only one book series on the most recent adoption, that that's the book that they're referring to, then I can code that. If I don't make that assumption, then I can't code that. So we have made that assumption. So again, if a school lists a publisher and a year that corresponds to the most recent adoption, and if that publisher has only one series on that list, then we code that. And this is a lot. This is probably 30 to 40% of schools have at least one book where we have to make this kind of inference. All right? If I didn't make that assumption, now first of all I think that that assumption is actually right, because the vast majority of schools actually do adopt books on the list. Almost all schools adopt books on the list for their sort of core textbooks. But if I didn't make that assumption, then I would have just way more missing data than I do have. All right, so this is the second best. This is the third best, and this is actually not good. So this is from San Ramon Valley. And the challenge here in mathematics, so McDougall-Littell did publish a math book that was adopted on the 2008 adoption cycle. But actually the state adopted 2 McDougall-Littell series in 2008. And so I don't know which one it is. And there's no way to know which one it is unless I would call and ask. It turns out that 14% of schools have at least one book that is like this. That is, there is some information, but there's not enough information, even with that assumption that I mentioned on the previous slide, to actually decide what book that is. All right? And so again, that's 14% of schools, about 1 in 7 schools have at least one book like that. And in total, it's about 9% of all the textbooks listed in the state have this kind of missing data problem. This is the next worst kind of data. So this is an actual SARC. This is from Alum Rock. And here the school district simply says that they provide adequate books, but they don't provide the titles anywhere. And so again, we could contact the school and we could ask, but there's no information here. And then the absolute worst would be this kind of SARC. which does exist. There are some schools where we cannot find a SARC, meaning it's not on the SARC website, we can't find it on the district website, or students spend some time on Google and no one can find the SARC. So if you add up this kind of problem with this kind of problem, because really they're the same thing, there's no information, that's about 6.5% of schools in the state. 493 schools in the state where there is no information, 493 K-8 schools, where there's no information that we can find about their textbooks. And that would also include, by the way, some districts don't provide a SARC, but they do provide like a PDF on their website that lists what books they use. And so in general, for these kind of districts, we went and we looked and we couldn't find anything. So that's 493, and by the way, there are 7,600 schools in our data, 7,600 K-8 schools. All right? So that was just an illustration in math of the challenges that we had. And so, I'm going to present to you now some basic descriptive data on where we are as of 2014-15. So we've done this process now for 2012-13, 13-14, and 14-15. And the funding from Gates is going to allow us to do it for 15-16. The hope is that we will be funded to do this in perpetuity until such time as the state decides to make my life easier. So we have, as I said, 7,600 schools in California that contain a grade between K and 8. 86% of those schools, so about 6,568 of them, have at least one book that we can identify in code. So that means, so 14% have at least one book that we cannot identify. That's, again, the McDougall-Littels of the world. And 493 schools, or 7%, provide no information about textbooks anywhere that we can find. And those 493 districts are spread across 493 schools are spread across 205 districts. So actually that makes this turn out to be mostly small districts. And I don't have like a regression that shows that, but I can tell you based on having looked at those districts, there are a lot of small districts. A lot of them are located like near the Nevada border, for instance. So that's just the state of our data. What are the most popular books? So as of 14-15, these are the most popular elementary math textbooks in the state. Those with school numbers there those are approximate rounded to the nearest 10. The bolded ones are Common Core books. And the non-bolded ones are non-Common Core books. So this was as of 14-15. The most common book in the state was a book from the previous adoption cycle, Scott Forsman, Addison Wesley, Envision, California. You can see Envision Common Core was also very commonly adopted. Then we have Go Math Common Core is actually the top Common Core book in the state. And the other interesting thing I think on this slide is this one. Actually, both of those rows. So Engage New York is, first of all, not a traditional textbook. It's something you get from the Engage New York website. It was something created by the state of New York through their Race to the Top funds. Not a traditional textbook. Not on the state-approved list for 2014, but it is very widely used. Most common Common Core aligned book in California, at least as of 14-15, which is the most current data we have. Eureka Math is just the textbook version of Engage New York, right? Also not on the state-approved list. But you can see from this that, well, I think one thing you can see is that the top book isn't a Common Core book. So even as of 14-15, a lot of schools were still using old materials. And second, that these non-state approved books are doing pretty well in terms of market share. Certainly better than, so if we're looking at this list of books, I can tell you that prior to Common Core, there were no books that weren't on the state approved list that were nearly this popular. So that's a new thing, I think, is for schools to be adopting off-list, in particular Engage New York. I should have said this, by the way, but feel free to raise your hand and ask questions. Yeah?
Could you go back to the previous slide? The vision one, is that for sure because it's an older text, or are they pushing back against Common Core?
So this would be, so this is Scott Forsman and Vision California, which was a book on the state approved list in '08. So these were schools that adopted that book and haven't yet adopted a new book. I haven't specifically looked, but no districts that are making adoption decisions now are adopting old books. They're all adopting Common Core books. This is middle school math. Similar patterns, so I'm not going to dwell on it here, but you see that the most common book is not a Common Core book. That's from the previous adoption cycle. And I put a greater than 370 here because, again, a lot of the McDougall-Littell books we can't say for sure whether it's this series or the other McDougall-Littell series, which is McDougall-Littell Structure and Method. So we don't know for sure. It's at least 370. And then these are all on-list books for the Common Core books. And just for context here, there's about 2,200 schools in the state that serve middle school grades. So you're looking at, you know, about 1 in 6 or 1 in 7 that have adopted these most common books. And in K to 5, there's about 5,200 schools here. So that's a little bit more than 1 in 4 are using Envision. That might be just driven by LAUSD, might be an Envision district. I actually don't know. All right, so that's sort of descriptively where we are. The percent of schools that you might be interested in the percent of schools that have adopted a Common Core aligned book. And note here, I'm not making judgments about how aligned these books actually are. I actually did a study of Envision Common Core alignment, and it was not very good. But that's really a separate question. So what you can see here is that 2014-15, we just crossed the 50% threshold in terms of the number of schools that have adopted one or more Common Core aligned textbook. So one thing I'll say, and I don't have the hard numbers in front of me, but is that this number, 50%, is far lower than I'm seeing in the other states that I'm studying. So in Illinois and New York, it's very close to 100% of schools have adopted a Common Core aligned material. And so what do I attribute that to? I would say I attribute it to two things. One, California being a textbook adoption state, their math textbook adoption was a little bit late, right? It was I think it was in 13-14. And I can tell you, you'll see in the interview results that I'm going to present later, that districts care a lot about what's on the state approved list, and they don't generally move before the state does. And second, I think California has not really had accountability, consequential accountability for schools for a few years. And I think one consequence of that is that schools haven't felt as much pressure as they have in other states where they started new Common Core tests earlier, and those tests had stakes attached to them earlier. And this is not really a value judgment about which way is better. It's just, again, in other states, this number is much closer to 100%. So now I'm a little bit more quickly going to go through the other two subjects. And I'm just going to illustrate these because what we're learning is that different subjects have different issues. So in science, the last state adoption was in 2006 for textbooks. The good thing about science is that there are far fewer unique titles that are out there. Most publishers publish only one textbook series at elementary and one textbook series at middle, so we don't have the same problem of McDougall-Littell. I will say that many schools put on their SARCs off-list materials, things like science websites, teacher-created materials, etc. And we do have more success in filling in missing data in science than in math. So in math, we had around 10% missing data originally, which we were able to get down a little bit. In science, we only had 5% missing data. So it's just an easier task in science than in math. But there are some challenges. So so I'll just walk through an example that I think illustrates. So if they list Scott-Forsman, and for elementary grades, that's actually pretty easy. Scott-Forsman only makes one series in elementary school. They might instead list Pearson for elementary school. Now, Pearson actually doesn't make an elementary science textbook that we are aware of, but they do publish Scott-Forsman. So we assume that if they list Pearson, that they meant Scott-Forsman. In contrast, if they list Pearson and a middle school, well, Pearson turns out to publish 2 middle school series, Prentice Hall, Science Explorer, and then the Focus On series. And so we actually can't tell the difference here. And we're not 100% sure that there is a difference. So we don't know the answer to that question, because one thing you might notice is that one says Focus on Physical Science, and this one's also Focus on Physical Science. But they might be different. I'd have to buy the books and look, and so I don't currently have plans to do that, but I might. I will tell you I have stacks of math textbooks in my office already, because we are going to be doing some analysis of math textbooks. If they say something like Focus on Life, actually it turns out that all 3 major publishers publish something called Focus on Life. So we don't know for sure, and all 3 of those were adopted by on the 2006 list. So we actually don't know. So that's Glencoe, McDougall, Littell, and Prentice Hall all do a Focus on Life. And then the last thing is if they list something that's really not on the state approved list, if they just put Holt. Holt is sort of the bane of my existence, because Holt could be Holt McDougall, could be Holt Reinhardt Winston. This is true in math as well. Holt Science and Technology, or it could also be this, because that's also affiliated with Holt in some way. And my PhD students are actually more the expert than I am at this point on like the different imprints and the different publishers, which are very hard to keep track of because publishers merge and all the time. So all that said, where are we in science? So this is what we know in science. The most common book. So first of all, there is no Common Core in science, right? And so all of these books are from the last adoption, which is 2006. There are no NGSS Next Generation Science Standards materials on here yet. What we can see is that actually they're much more concentrated in science than they were in math. 1,800, as I said, the denominator here was about 5,200. Have adopted Macmillan McGraw-Hill, and these other ones here. The bolded here are middle schools. All right. So before bolded meant Common Core, and now bold means middle school. So that's the takeaway here, is that science is more concentrated. And then very quickly I'm going to go through ELA. ELA is a nightmare, and so I'm actually not going to present results to you from ELA, but I'm going to show you why ELA is such a problem. First of all, our conversations with people in school districts, including both district leaders and teachers, just tell us that teachers don't use textbooks in ELA like they do in math and science. All right? And furthermore, the nature of ELA means that there are many different kinds of series that we might be talking about when we're talking about a textbook, right? There might be a grammar book, there might be a basal reader, there might be a handwriting book, or ELD or Spanish language textbooks. So there's just a lot more possibilities out there. And of course we know, and I think we have or at least we have a very strong sense that even if we did know what book they use, actually that teachers use the book less in ELA, and they do more of these other things. They bring in reading materials from outside, they cobble together individual lessons, et cetera, and of course none of that is going to be captured on the SARC. So I'll illustrate why this is such a challenge with Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, which is one of the major publishers of ELA materials. So Houghton Mifflin Harcourt actually has a whole pile of materials on the state approved list. The state approved list was from 2008. And so we have 2 elementary, California Excursions and California Reading. Note they later renamed California Reading to be California Reading Medallion Edition, which we believe to be the same thing as just California Reading. 2 middle school, and then 2 intervention materials. So we've got 6 possibilities here. And so So we come up with problems like this. If a school lists Holt, then we have 2 middle school texts, and we just don't know which of those middle school texts. Furthermore, it could be some off-list Holt text, which those exist. If the school lists Houghton Mifflin in elementary school, then it could be one of 2 possibilities. It could be California Excursions or California Reading. And again, that's assuming it's not something else that's not on the list. If the school lists Treasures, which is a title, we believe at least 5 possibilities for what Treasures could indicate. There's Glencoe Treasures, California Reading Treasures, etc. I don't know why they all have chosen this title for their textbook series, but these are all different volumes and not from the same publisher. So sometimes we can use context clues, like we can look at other schools in the district, or we can look at district websites or what grades it serves. But this just illustrates why ELA is taking so long. And we'll see. I'm not sure we'll ever get there, actually. But so there is a new ELA adoption that just happened in the state. And schools are in the process of switching from pre-Common Core to Common Core ELA materials. I can tell you that the number is certainly much smaller than in mathematics. It's nowhere near 50%. Where we are now is that students are currently collecting 14-15 ELA data. We've got now 14-15. We're up through 14-15 in math and science, and we're doing ELA now. And finally, we really struggle with ELA because we just don't know this. The flagship series from the major publishers all have different titles, but we really don't know, and to our knowledge, no one's ever looked in terms of a research perspective on the extent to which they differ in actual content. I assume that they do, but we just don't know that. And I'm also not an ELA expert. I'm much more a math person. So all of this said, I think that the work, even where we are right now, which is still at a pretty raw state, has some implications for the Williams legislation. First of all, there's a non-trivial number of schools that seem to be missing SARCs altogether. And I don't know why. There might be some reason that I'm not aware of for why that's allowed. But I think that that's a problem because part of the intention of the Williams legislation was this public accountability that comes from reporting this information.
What is that number?
Yeah, that's...
Not the one that was, they didn't have the book name.
Oh, the actual number? Yeah. Well, it's less than 493. I think it's less than half of that. So I could get you that number. It would just, I'd have to look. Yeah.
Was that from their websites too, or that's what I'd like to know, because that was missing that you guys couldn't find. But
I mean, it might exist somewhere on the internet, but I will tell you that every time we couldn't find it on the SARC website, we went to the school district website. So it is possible that it exists. I will also say that if we who have spent all this time and poured all this money into it can't find it, that's, to me, functionally equivalent to it not existing. So that's one issue. The other issue, I think, is the much bigger issue, which is there are lots of reasons to look at the data and wonder what the purpose is of collecting the data. If you have problems like a lack of a common reporting requirement that makes large swaths of the data unusable, or usable, but you really have to have substantial knowledge to interpret what's on the SARCs. And this was something that really developed over time. At first we, when we first started coding, there would be lots of books that we couldn't identify, and we started making assumptions and talking to people and realizing that those assumptions seemed to be correct, and that allowed us to interpret things. But really, you have to have a ton of expertise to be able to make sense of these data. Also, from a simple formatting perspective, I'm not clear why you will collect the data but not collect them in any format that's usable. So this is really an unbelievable amount of effort just to get access to the data, just to copy and paste the names off the SARCs. I think that at the barest of minimums, the state could invest in just doing that so that people don't have to. And then last is, and this is sort of a more existential question for my own research, We also know that teachers are increasingly moving away from traditional textbooks. And so the work, I think, will continue to be relevant because large numbers of teachers still continue to use textbooks, particularly in certain grades and subjects like elementary math and science, I think. I think the title of the book tells you less and less about what's happening in the classroom. And the principle of the Williams legislation, I think, is not so much about really whether the student has access to a textbook per se, although it is partly about that. But it's really about whether a student has access to a quality curriculum. And if we have less and less confidence that the textbook really tells us anything about the curriculum that the student's being exposed to, then I'm not so sure what the implications are for the utility of the SARC data. Yeah?
It's my understanding the end game is to go completely computer-based education. Is that your understanding too? So I'd like
Yeah.
to see people say the textbook, but the computer-based education, and I was in this back in the 70s.
Right. You mean computer textbooks or, yeah, computer materials. Yeah.
Operant conditioning, we were talking about, we were actually looking at brain waves at the time, alpha waves and things like that, as to whether or not the student was paying attention. It was back in the 70s. But that, to me, the end game here is to get the whole lesson, the entire curriculum on the computer.
I think in many districts that's true, and they'll actually tell you that if you talk to them. And that in many districts is a factor when they're adopting a book, is they will tend to adopt a book that has a computer component with it, because they'll say things like, oh, in 3 years we're planning to be one-to-one Chromebook, and so we want to adopt a series that allows us to do that. I have no way of knowing that from the SARC data because schools don't list in the SARC whether they're using the computer version or a paper version. And I'll say in other states, in Texas, I didn't put in here any information about Texas, but Texas data is much better. And in Texas, I actually know what kind of license they have for each book and whether it comes with a computer version, et cetera. So that's a question that, unfortunately, I really can't answer with the SARC data.
Right.
Yeah.
One thing you might take a look at, everybody needs to be concerned about this. I used to teach neurocognition, et cetera, so I got a good background, and I was into electronics. But the Wi-Fi is, which is probably the direction they're going to go, and they're going that way now. But we're getting clouded with so much of that. There's a website that I have, it's called WiFiFacts.com, and I think people would take a look at that and would be very, very disturbed by that.
Well, I'm not. Yeah. So I mean, I'm not familiar with that science, but and I don't have a particular position on that. But I do think that there are, of course, legitimate questions to be asked about whether it's a good thing to be moving to computerized materials. I think beyond just that one, in terms of the question of how well can people learn from computer versus books. Yeah.
So I've gone with the ACLU on several what they would call validation visits.
Yeah.
To sample some schools.
Uh-huh.
And one of the challenges is the school will put down, here's their math program. But when you go class to class, some have very old versions.
Yeah.
Very old versions. So even though they'll put on the SARC 2005, some of them are really old, and I don't know if that.
So that.
To get at that, or
No, there's not at all a way to get at that from the SARC data.
I think it's at least an equity issue.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, two answers to that question. One, there's no way to know from the SARC data. I mean, in the 70% of schools, they could make it up completely, right? I would have no idea. In the 30%, if you go and audit, at least I guess you would know. The other thing I wanted to say is that, again, Texas provides an example that doesn't have that problem, because in Texas, in addition to knowing when they bought the book, because everything's tracked at the state level, all purchases. So you know what book they bought, and you also know the quantity they bought. And so presumably, therefore, if you know how many students are in the school, you would have a sense for whether every kid had a modern book. But as far as I know, there's no way to address that with the SARC data. Yeah.
So I'm John Appel from Public Advocates. I'm one of the lead counsel on the Williams case.
Oh, you should be giving this talk.
Well, thank you for doing this work. Just a few comments on your implications for legislation. Number one, the purpose of the exercise with the SARCs was not to necessarily identify
Right,
who
I
won.
understand that. Yeah, I know.
The purpose was to just see, of the standards aligned textbooks, does everything have one?
Yeah.
So I think you might consider suggesting, or get people like me in the civil rights community to suggest that the state board change the template
Mm-hmm.
to just add that specific information.
Yeah.
Now that we're in the era of Common Core, and note, well, I guess it already is required to note whether it's aligned with Common Core standards. A lot of the issues here, and the kind of the historical facts that you presented, have to do with funding,
Mm-hmm.
the ways that textbooks were funded in California.
Yeah.
So when we settled Williams, part of the settlement was to continue what the Schwarzenegger administration was going to end, and it had been going on for a long time, was to continue a textbook categorical.
Uh-huh.
And so that, we had the confidence, because they were going to continue that, and schools could only, they could buy their own textbooks, but almost no one did because they wanted the state money. If you're going to get the state money, you got to buy this off the list. It's going to be standards aligned. Almost everyone did that. So that's why we weren't concerned with
Yeah.
the title of the name. That has gone away now.
Right.
So you have that going away, converging with a recession
Mm-hmm.
that saw a cutback in school funding in general.
Mm-hmm.
And the state said during the recession, you don't have to do new adoptions. You know, we kind of gave ourselves a break for several years of doing, that's why you see 2006 science textbooks.
Yeah.
And then when the money started coming back, all of a sudden we had a new Common Core
Mhm.
adopted, we didn't have Common Core textbooks. We had the ability for people to teach Common Core offline materials. It was like a completely different world.
Yeah.
So that's all kind of happening in the background
Mm-hmm.
of why you want to do this. So there might be some specific policy things to do to kind of help you get better data and to track it. And, you know, we did update the legislation to kind of incorporate electronic instead of hard copy
Uh-huh.
textbooks being available. So,
Yeah.
but you're absolutely right. And the Eureka Math, I'm also president of my local school board.
Mm-hmm.
We've adopted the Eureka Math. It's not on the list. We don't get. It's not tied to funding, but it does seem to be pretty well aligned to Common Core.
Yeah. So is it still the case that you have to use this? Is there still there's no categorical?
So you get a lump sum.
Right, and so you can buy whatever you want.
You can use it for whatever.
Okay, that's what I thought.
So
All right.
yeah. Anyway, so that's what I think.
Thank you very much. Very helpful. So, so you might ask, why are we doing all this work? Because it's a lot of work. It's been about 2 years, by the way, since we started this project, and and that was just for data collection and cleaning. So I think that the work has many uses. I'm going to illustrate one of the uses, which is this one today. But all of these things are, and the great thing is once you have the data and once it's clean, you can continue to use it for all kinds of things. And I've been able to impress upon my students who are now more interested in this topic why this is a useful topic. They're doing dissertations on it. Again, we're going to hire a postdoc who's going to participate in this work. So there's lots you can do. So we're going to look at the impact of textbook adoption choices on student achievement from the 2008 elementary math adoption cycle. The other ones that I know that I'm going to do are these two. So I know I'm going to look at who's adopting Common Core aligned math materials and when. So we're at about 50% now, but is that transition happening equitably, or is it happening more in certain kinds of districts? And then I'm also going to look, because people are very interested in the differences between charter and traditional public schools, and to my knowledge, no one's ever looked at curriculum material differences between those two sectors. So I think that that's an interesting question. So those are the things we can look at, and there's plenty of other things we can look at too, all right? So to address this first question, do textbooks matter? This is work that I'm doing with a couple of economist friends of mine who are at the University of Missouri, and they are really the methodologists, but I understand it just enough to present to you. So the research question here is, what's the impact of textbook adoption choices made during the 07-08 adoption cycle on student achievement? We used textbook data from the 2012-13 SARC, and because the SARCs say when the book was adopted, we have in essence a panel of textbook adoption data. So we pair those 2012-13 SARC data with a longitudinal school-level data set from the CDE that contains school average scale scores and subgroup average scale scores from 2003 to 2013, and we also add in some variables from the US Census. So you might ask me, why am I looking at this cycle? That's particularly boring and irrelevant cycle now that we're no longer in that era. But it's a data thing, right? We need to have several years post-adoption to look at the impact. And so there are a lot of data restrictions that take our sample from the 5,200 schools serving grades K to 5 down to the number that we end up with, which is around 2,000. And so what are those restrictions? Well, first of all, we need adequate sample sizes. We need we can't study the impact of a book that was adopted in one school. And I will tell you that there are some schools that adopt these totally random, off-list things. By the way, I think that's another very interesting question. And so we can't study those. We only can study the most common books, which are all going to be on-list books. We need schools that use one book across all elementary grades, and some schools will adopt multiple series, or we won't know what grades they use them in. And we need an adoption close to the cycle in order to look multiple years after, and also because we think that there might be something different between schools that adopt on-cycle and schools that adopt off-cycle. So as I said, this brings us down to around 2,000 schools. So the intuition for this work is that we find schools that look a lot alike pre-adoption. They look alike in terms of demographics, they look alike in terms of test scores, they look alike in terms of size, which actually size is the most important variable that predicts adoption choices. Then we match schools that looked a lot alike but made different adoption choices, and then we track their achievement trajectories for several years after. So we use three complementary quantitative methods here. We use propensity score matching, which is, in essence, what we're doing is we're taking each treatment school that adopts a particular book and we're matching it to one or more control schools that adopt a different book. And then we use two other approaches that we use because this approach is very data hungry and makes it hard to identify effects. So these ones just have a few more assumptions and then allow us to, the trade-off is they allow us to find effects that we might not see with the propensity score matching. So we do all of our matching at the school level, not at the district level. And the reason we do our matching at the school level is twofold. First of all, it's a sample size thing. So matching at the school level it greatly increases our sample size, allows us to find these effects. And second of all, there are some non-uniform adopting districts in California. So not every district, all schools adopt the same book. And so we can take advantage of that. So that's all I have for the methods. I'm not going to show you an equation or anything like that. But the working paper is available online, and I'm happy to share that with you. And so the original plan was to do pairwise comparisons among the most common books. And these are the 4 most popular books in those years. So we were going to do, this would be 6 pairwise comparisons among those 4 books. It turns out that we don't have enough statistical power to do that. And our preliminary analyses suggested that Houghton Mifflin California Math was better than the other 3 in terms of its achievement impacts. So we ended up comparing Houghton Mifflin California Math to a composite of the other 3. All right, so that's the comparison that we do. And so I'm just going to jump right into results. And there's a lot of stuff on this slide, but I'm going to walk you through what I think are the most relevant things. So the first thing is the impacts. So the impacts, here we have 1, 2, 3, 4 years after the adoption. All right, and so we centered based on the adoption. So if some schools adopted in 8 and some schools adopted in 9, then right, we're going to center around whatever adoption year we use. So we see, first of all, positive effects. And you can see that because we have these bars here that are in the range of 0.05 to 0.08 standard deviations, and most of them are statistically significant. The 3 leftmost bars in each group of 6 are the math effects. All right? And I'll tell you in a second why we also look for ELA effects. But what you can see is there are these positive effects. One interesting thing to note is that the effects do not get larger as the book continues to be used in the school. You might expect that it would. So we don't have a great explanation for this, but it could simply be that mere exposure to the book, if the book is, say, better aligned with the assessment or something else in 3rd grade, that mere exposure to the book improves student learning. Now these effects, as I said, are 0.05 to 0.08 standard deviations, which is equivalent to moving a kid from about the 50th to the 54th percentile. So it's not a huge effect, but again, the marginal cost of choosing this book over any of the other books on the list is $0 basically. So in terms of impact to dollars, it's a really good ratio. So what are all these other bars on the graphs? Well, we want to make sure that we think that we have confidence that these results are real. So there's 2 ways that we do that. One is by looking at impacts on ELA, on English Language Arts achievement. And you wouldn't expect impacts of a math textbook on English Language Arts achievement. And we don't find evidence of impacts on English Language Arts achievement because these 3 rightmost bars in each group are none of them statistically significant. And the other thing that we do is we do a sort of like a placebo test, they call it. And we look at the impact before adoption. Now, you wouldn't expect there to be an impact of adoption before it happened. And again, that's what we find. So overall, we see that Houghton Mifflin California Math outperforms the other books in 3rd grade by around 0.05 to 0.08 standard deviations. And that effect does not get bigger as years go on. Next, we look at 4th grade. So our study is actually the first that looks at multiple grades, the first ever quasi-experimental study that we know of that looks at impacts across multiple grades. And interestingly, in 4th grade, the effects look smaller. And again, you might say, boy, in 4th grade, the effects should probably be bigger, like maybe the effects get bigger as you go on. Well, I don't think that that's necessarily the case because I think it's reasonable. I mean, they're different books, right? A 3rd grade book and a 4th grade book are different books. And it's reasonable at least to hypothesize that books might have different effects by grades. Some grades might just be better than other grades. And in 4th grade, we find suggestive evidence of positive effects, but they're not as big and they're not as statistically significant. And then in 5th grade, the effects are bigger, and unlike in 3rd grade, they actually get bigger by year of implementation as well. So this is kind of the pattern that you would most expect to see. And so we do see that the 5th grade edition seems to be having a positive impact, and that ranges 0.05 to 0.1 standard deviations in 5th grade. So overall, we see Houghton Mifflin California Math is more effective than the other 3 textbooks that we compared it to. We also ran these analyses by subgroup, by socioeconomically disadvantaged, and we find that the impacts are larger for socioeconomically disadvantaged students than for non-socioeconomically disadvantaged students, in some cases by as much as a factor of 2. So why is this work important? Well, maybe it's not that important because districts aren't using these books anymore. But we think that the study shows that Houghton Mifflin California Math increases math achievement. We're very confident in those results. This is the first study that shows these effects persisting across 4 years. We have the longest post-adoption panel of any previous study, and the first study to show that these effects occur in multiple grades. These effects are small, but modest, but educationally meaningful, again, given that these books don't really differ in terms of their cost. And district decision makers have typically not had this kind of information when they've made adoption decisions. And so we think that this kind of work could potentially, if there were more studies across multiple states, start to lead to different kinds of decisions. And we're not saying that every district should make the adoption decision that's based on state test scores, but that's another piece of data that states could consider as they were making adoption decisions. So we're going to be continuing this work. The funding from Gates is actually to do basically the same thing but with the Common Core books. And we're only going to have 2 years of post-adoption data there, but that's the plan. We're also going to be working with researchers at Harvard to do some statewide surveys so we can link the book of record to what we've learned, to what teachers are actually saying they're doing in classrooms. And so finally, I'm going to end with something more qualitative and actually, I think, maybe more interesting to some folks in the room, which is, we just presented evidence that textbooks differ in their impact on student achievement. We actually don't have a real strong sense of how districts make adoption decisions. That's not something that research has really investigated. And in particular, what are the data sources they use, right? We have a sense that districts are very concerned about alignment, but we also have a sense that they can't be that interested in effectiveness because that evidence does not exist anywhere. So we are interested in investigating this issue around California. And so what we've done is we're doing semi-structured interviews, phone interviews, with a sample of districts around topics like this. How districts evaluate of materials, how do they care about alignment and how do they evaluate alignment? What are the books they consider? What's the whole process really like? And then we also ask them about teacher use. And so to do this, we did a stratified random sample of 32 districts in the state. And we based these, the strata that we use are size, average student achievement, and adoption status, whether they had adopted a Common Core on-list or off-list book, whether they were still using an old book, or whether they were one of those districts where we couldn't figure out what they were using. We spoke with the person most directly responsible for instructional materials in the district, who's usually someone like an assistant superintendent for curriculum and instruction. We gave them a $100 Amazon gift card. We've still struggled to get people to respond to this, but we've been able to do 21 out of our target 32 interviews. And so I'm going to present to you some very preliminary findings. This is the first time that these have seen the light of day, based on our qualitative coding. And we started by coding along the lines of our interview protocol, these themes here. And what we found in doing our initial coding is that there seems to be the variable that seems to matter is district size. That there are very different processes in small districts versus everyone else. All right, and so I'm just going to illustrate some of those differences with some quotes from district leaders. So one thing is that districts seem to differ in terms of how they gather information about which textbook should sort of be in front of them or be on the board for something to consider, right? And so all districts, every single district that we talk to, uses the state-approved list as a starting point. Smaller districts often described waiting, purposefully waiting, and gathering information from other nearby districts or from the County Department of Education. This was not something that medium-sized or large districts ever reported, but small districts often reported relying on those county offices of education to help them make decisions. Small districts also reported that they didn't really get publisher presentations or publisher-delivered professional development, whereas the medium and large districts almost always reported that this was actually a key element of their decision-making process. So this is a quote from a small rural district. He said, we don't get the reps up here and we don't look at Houghton Mifflin's and then the Macmillan people and then the whatever. Now it's National Geographic jumping in. We sometimes encounter those people down at the county seat when we have our monthly meetings of all the superintendents. It's rare when we'll see what the city school sees, where they'll have 4 or 5 different publishers to look at all the material. we rely on seeing what circles through. You know what I mean? After everybody's started, when the piloting's beginning to wind down and a couple districts are adopting, then we'll take notice and we'll say who likes what. So they're relying on other districts, and this was definitely a small district phenomenon. When they actually go to evaluate the materials, there are also some differences. So typically, they will pilot, so about half the districts, I would say, will pilot the materials in some way or another. Those pilot studies might last a couple weeks. They might last an entire year. Some districts, typically actually the larger districts, will just adopt a material without piloting. And as I hinted on that last slide, some districts wait to see how other districts feel about the materials that they've adopted. Right? They'll call around and ask. In terms of alignment to standards, small districts typically say that they don't investigate alignment to standards, that they trust that if it's on the state-approved list that it's well aligned. And I think that this is largely a capacity issue. They don't feel like they have the capacity or the time to really do this. They also sometimes noted that they didn't feel the same kinds of accountability pressures as the medium and large districts did. This could just be the small districts that we spoke to. In contrast, medium and large districts focus very heavily on alignment, and I would say it's one of the primary things that they consider. They typically do their own alignment investigations, even though the state has also done that. So in a medium and large district, this is something very typical that they would say, absolutely, the first major criterion is alignment to the standards, and in having sat on the state committee, in order for the materials to even be approved, we had to find every single standard. So anyway, we were looking from our piloting teams how well the books met the standards. That was the first criteria. And in contrast, a small district says, in essence, accountability doesn't matter so much for this small district, right? Unless there's something that's really breathing down their neck, right? And we try to do the best we can, but a real superintendent, a superintendent in a larger district is going to have a business manager, a curriculum person, somebody just devoted to government mandated requirements, and I'm all three of those. So the implication being they don't really have the time or the resources to investigate something like this. And finally, in terms of teachers and implementation, we find that in medium and large districts, they tend to be much less flexible in terms of implementation. They're more likely to produce a pacing guideline and have district benchmarks. And district leaders believe that teachers really use those pacing guidelines. I don't know whether that's actually true. We'll find out when we start asking teachers. And district leaders reported, many district leaders reported that teachers really don't fully understand Common Core. We were focused primarily on math, but we often heard district leaders say that teachers want something that's easy or that resembles what they've already been doing. And whereas the district leaders say that they want something that meets the Common Core. Now this is, right, that's probably a little bit of like self-aggrandizement here, but nonetheless, that's what we heard repeatedly. And this is often more apparent in large or uniform adopting districts than it is in small districts where there maybe seem to be tighter relationships or tighter cohesion. So what work is next? So we're going to be finishing and reporting these district interviews. We've got 11 more to do. Our hope is to conduct interviews with at least one teacher in each of these 32 districts as well, so we can get a teacher perspective on what we're hearing from the district leaders. Another piece that I haven't discussed at all is we are actually planning to look inside some of these books, and that in its own is a huge task. And the funding from W.T. Grant is specifically focused on this. So we're looking at 8th grade math books, the most common pre- and post-Common Core 8th grade math books, and we're going to look at how the content of those books has changed. So to conclude, I hope I've illustrated that textbooks matter. Previous research shows that textbooks matter, and we find evidence that textbooks matter in California, at least in elementary math. The SARC data are poor, and while they were not intended for the research purpose that they are being used for, I think that they could be made better relatively easily if the state was interested in making them better. And if they were better, I think that they could have many research uses. There appear to be large differences across districts in how they make adoption decisions. And I believe that those differences are driven primarily by capacity differences. And finally, right now I'm a little bit of a lone wolf in this area in terms of a policy-focused person who's doing research on textbooks. And I'm hopeful that this work, as it starts to get out there, will encourage more people to do work on this topic, because I think that it's very important, and I think that it really affects what's going on in classrooms.
Okay, I want to thank Morgan